First of all, it's very inspiring talks. And I think our perception and perspectives on service systems have been really broadened and widened and deepened as a result of these talks. I have the challenge to frame the field of smart service systems with human factors at its core. And obviously, anyone who does this does it from his or her own perspective and history. And so that's what I'm doing here. And you'll see that, for instance, some of the wonderful things we've heard from the previous panel are unfortunately not included explicitly here, but maybe we could include them implicitly. So first of all, probably most of you know that services are usually defined by subtraction. It's anything in the economy, anything that people do that's not manufacturing, mining, or agriculture. And you see all those things that are listed there, which are services. And then there's the issue of service science. And well, service science, let's go back and talk about services. It used to be that, at least I'm old enough to remember, most of you probably are not, when you pick up a telephone, which had a 7-digit number like Devonshire 89000, number please, these are the words you heard. There were human operators like those, no longer in business. They were put out of business in the 1950s. Floor please, you're getting the elevator. There used to be an elevator operator. Fill it up. Well, you heard this question when you stopped to get gasoline. Most places today, other than New Jersey, you don't hear this so often. Do you want any large bills? Well, you used to have to get cash out of a bank. You have to go interact with a human teller in banker's hours between 10 and 3. So the evolution of services, technology has come in. Moore's Law has played a huge role, and you'll hear more about Moore's Law tomorrow morning at one of our talks. So you think of any major service like telephone, banking, gas stations, supermarkets, et cetera. Over the years, paid labor, like these telephone operators, have been subtracted out, and our labor has been inserted. Instead of the telephone operators making a connection, we dial it ourselves. So, and that's usually facilitated by technology. Now, I used to say, how did I ever exist without word processors? I'm old enough that when I started, it was with typewriters, pretty soon electric typewriters, but I'm old enough to know what CC means at the bottom of a letter. If you ask most millennials what that means, they'll have no concept. How did I ever exist without email? How did I ever exist without the web? And now I say, and you can guess, how did I ever exist without Google? So there it is. Google now has an office right next to MIT. So the science of services is not new. So we should bow to the history and those who have contributed to it and created intellectual foundations, because there's certain rigor and rigorousness that we should bring to our research on services. Queuing is one of my favorite topics because I hate to wait in line, so I have to study it to get rid of some of my anxiety. And so most services involve queuing in some sense. And 2 years ago, the science and engineering of queuing celebrated in Copenhagen its 100th birthday. The Danish telephone engineer A.K. Erlang invented queuing for the Danish telephone company, the Copenhagen Telephone Company, to figure out the capacity size of this new invention, the telephone centralized switch. And his formulas have stood the test of time. They're still the most popular formulas to use when you're studying queuing systems. Now, okay, so you're an engineer or industrial engineer, operations researcher, you study queuing systems, you got these formulas, have these methods, Markov chains, Markov processes, blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, it's the middle of the 1950s in New York City, and you hear lots of people complaining about elevator delays because there are rush hours for elevators, just like there are rush hours in the streets for taxis, cabs, buses, subways, et cetera. And so Russ Akoff of the University of Pennsylvania sends one of his junior people, whose name he forgot, I interviewed him for this tidbit, to investigate this. And indeed, there were elevator delays because of rush hours at let's say 9 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And people might have to wait a minute or two for the elevator to come. It would make it even worse in those days. Like in the lobby, today you often see the floor that the elevators are on, so that manages your expectations. So they didn't have that either. So to stereotype an OR industrial engineer type, they might say, well, we have to empty the buildings, dynamite them, start over again with twice as many elevator shafts because the number of queuing servers is insufficient to meet peak demand. Well, in this case, studying these elevators, the person sent from University of Pennsylvania said, well, maybe the problem is defined incorrectly. Maybe the problem isn't the complaint, maybe the problem isn't the elevator statistics, the delay statistics like a minute or two. Maybe it's the complaints about the delays. If we could do something to reduce the complaints about the delays to near zero, maybe we would solve the problem. And a great inspiration of lateral and creative thinking. He said, well, let's try mirrors next to all the elevators, floor-to-ceiling mirrors. We'll put them in this experimental building and see what happens. They put the mirrors in, guess what? The complaints about delays dropped to near zero. The statistics of the delays were unchanged. There were no theorems proved. There were no equations written. There were no variables or parameters, but a lot of common sense and lateral thinking. Now, this is kind of an iconic story now in the history of operations research, where sometimes it's not the math that's so important, but it's looking at the human interaction and what the humans were doing. And in this case, the humans, if they were males, might straighten their ties or make sure their hair is combed. Females might do analogous things. It was even found that on occasion, a male and female might coyly flirt through the reflection. Somehow it was less provocative than eye-to-eye contact. So, and the mirrors solved the problem for about 90 seconds to 2 minutes of delay. And if the elevator got there within that time, everyone was happy. So to me, this is an example that you can generalize to lots of things and services that go on today. Basically diversions, entertainment, education in queuing situations. There are many, many examples. Manhattan Savings Bank had no high tech, had no ATMs. All their high net worth people had to do banking transactions at lunch hour. The queues were very long. So they brought in a concert pianist in one of the branches. Guess what? The complaints about the delays dropped to zero. People, after they finished their banking transactions, stayed in the lobby until the current song was over. So brilliant. So sometimes there's a psychology component, and sometimes that can save lives. Now, I don't know if this is public information, but I guess since we're on the internet today, it is. But AT&T invented for the old-fashioned landline telephone calls a cue discipline for how you get a dial tone. If you think about it, a dial tone should be instantaneous, and for most of us, most of the time it is. But for instance, sometimes on Mother's Day, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at the East Coast, you pick up the phone on Mother's Day when everyone else is doing the same thing, calling their mom long distance, and where's that dial tone? What do? You hang it up, you do it again. Wait 5 seconds, and then me, I have 3 degrees of electrical engineering, so then I'll jiggle the wires to make sure all the wires are connected. And so this sometimes happens. You don't get a dial tone right away. With cell phones, in cases of crisis and emergency, you can't get a channel. So there is a queuing situation there. So AT&T invested millions of dollars and a couple of years of research, and they created the queuing system for delivering a telephone dial tone. You enter a 2-priority queue. You enter as priority 2, last come, first serve. If you're still without a dial tone after 15 seconds, you shift to priority 1, first come, first serve. No priority 2 customers are served when a priority 1 queue is non-empty. Why does this make sense? So I leave you to ponder that, and if we have time at the end, I will explain it to you. So that's a little bit of a challenge. You see what's going on here. You see what it took the millions of dollars, lots of humans to interact with, and they have patents on this. Okay. So with us, we have lots of questions. Does smart necessarily mean computers? You know, I've seen lots of smart service systems without computers. What's the appropriate balance? Technology, human factors, systems analysis, operations research? Especially considering that a lot of us exist in silos, and we might want to overemphasize one of these things that represents our silos. Is innovation by accretion a sufficient framing of the problem? I think when we heard about the Veterans Administration today, by accretion I mean you add on to the current system. You think that all improvements can be by adding on to the current system. Well, it seems like the VA system has to be completely restructured, or in a major restructuring. And those of us in education, you know, we added an associate dean for this problem. We added an assistant provost for that problem, rather than saying, well, maybe we should, you know, restructure it. So innovation by accretion. And we do this with technology. We do it in education. We say, well, we'll add computers. We'll drop $100 computers over these developing countries by parachutes, and all the educational problems of those countries will be solved. Not true. Does there exist any service system for which a single performance measure suffices? And I would suggest no, in that to evaluate any service system, you need a vector of service, a collection of performance measures, and no single performance measure will suffice. And in fact, if you put in a single one, I can cite you many examples where the unintended negative consequences far dominate the previous solution. So our suggested axiom here, there exists no silver bullet. There it is. It doesn't exist. Now, so there's this desire in what we're trying to collectively do to create academic rigor, as well as have these partnerships with industry, as well as interact, have a human touch. And this is all very complicated, especially those of us who are silo dwellers. And on the academic side, the tendency might be to overly formalize. And so, we'll admit that some of us do this, but I say excess rigor can cause rigor mortis. Rigor mortis, in this case, is the irreversible stiffening of a profession caused by excessive fixation with rigor. And believe me, it exists in academia. So the importance of human behavior in what we do. Well, I'm an OR guy, operations research, and sometimes operations research is trivialized. At a cocktail party, I said, "What do you do, Larson?" I said, "Well, I'm an operations researcher." And first of all, they'll say, "Well, that's good. Those doctors need somebody in the OR room to understand what they're doing and improve their services during operations." And then I'll explain a little bit more, and they say, I understand. Now you're an optimizer." I hate that characterization also. So a lot of our work, maybe most of it, is inanimate objects, not inanimate objects, but people. And so the systems of interest, which include airlines, the healthcare infrastructure, supply chain, response of humans, like the elevator situation, and their reactions and behavior, those are the first order issues to consider. So humans first, all else second or third, is a recurring theme of this workshop. And one of the research areas that we've done over the last 6 years, funded by IBM, the Sloan Foundation, and the CDC, is pandemic influenza, systems to reduce the chance of us getting pandemic flu, or actually even the seasonal flu. So one of the first equations we derived, it's a three-line thing, is the basic reproductive number, R0, sometimes called R naught, is equal to lambda times P. You're at MIT, you need at least one Greek letter today. Here it is, lambda. So lambda is the frequency of daily contacts that somebody has when they're out and about. Okay, P is the conditional probability of transmitting the infection, given that one of the contact pair is infected and infectious, and the other is susceptible. And so therefore, and R0 first came from demographics in Germany in the 1880s, is the population growth rate over time. So if R0 is greater than 1, you're going to have exponential growth, and you're going to have an epidemic or a pandemic. If we can create R0 less than 1, the disease will die away. Ebola, unfortunately, has an R0 significantly greater than 1. H1N1 in 2009 had an R0 about 1.5. Okay, so basically, but look at this. Here's a parameter in a mathematical model, and it's based almost entirely on human behavior. The P does have aspects of the biology of the particular influenza. So the particular genetic makeup of that flu that year influences P, but also other things. So lambda is basically your frequency of contacts, and maybe you want to do social distancing. Maybe you want to work from home over the internet. Let's talk about P. Okay, so there's a component of it which relies on the particular flu, but there's other components of it, like wash your hands 6 times a day and sing happy birthday to yourself twice under hot soap and water. Or do an elbow shake rather than a handshake. Don't hug and kiss your friends during the flu season if people are around you have the flu. So these are ways you can reduce P as well. And we don't have time to go into it, but R0 also is the mean value of a random variable. So some people are super spreaders, might infect 40 people, others might infect 0. So if R0 is 1.5, you have a whole probability distribution whose mean is 1.5. That is also often not considered by epidemiologists, by the WHO and the CDC. So you're here now at the Engineering Systems Division, and I think the Engineering Systems Division way of looking at things is very compatible with the way NSF is suggesting that we look at things in these smarter service systems, basically to look in the Venn diagram intersection of the traditional engineering, or from my point of view, operations research, management in the social sciences, particularly the social sciences because of the human element. So look at that. That's Sweden, the day they switched sides of driving on the road. That's more typical. They're all driving on the correct side of the road. So consider urban traffic congestion. Acute now, okay, so urban traffic congestion, we just saw two examples, pretty bad. And if you've been around Boston in a taxi or trying to drive, sometimes it can be pretty bad, especially if it's rush hour. So a queue theorist might see this as a network of queues. One familiar with the psychology of queues might see this as an environment that risks increased anxiety levels among drivers, perhaps even leading to queue rage. And people, unfortunately, have used their cars as weapons if they get angry. An economist might focus on lost productivity due to time wasted in traffic. An environmentalist would be concerned with the air pollution and increased carbon footprint. A traffic engineer might focus on better timing of the traffic lights. And you can continue this. And I think that's the siloed way of thinking that we want to get out of going forward in these smarter service systems. So a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary service scientist, there she is, might combine the best of all these perspectives into an integrated interdisciplinary analysis of urban traffic congestion. She would frame the problem not in a canyon or silo, but on a wide prairie. So she would include analysis of options not usually considered by the canyon dwellers. Think of putting the mirrors next to elevators. Think laterally, think out of the box. Don't take today's situation as a set of constraints. She might negotiate staggered work times for key employers, like the city of Boston did in 1918 during the Great Spanish Flu to reduce the infections of people. So they had 4 different starting times and closing times of major Boston businesses in 1918, and they negotiated that in a week. So the constraint that everyone has to start at 9 o'clock clearly is not written in stone. Bike lanes to encourage commuting by bicycle, congestion pricing, such as done in Singapore and London, incentives to use public transportation, incentives to carpool, local use of borrowed zip cars, tax subsidies for new infrastructure supporting electric vehicles, property tax relief for developers of high-density housing near public transportation centers, and more. So her analysis would be just as rigorous, but without rigor mortis, as those canyon dwellers. And so she'd have to have considerably more expertise than any of the canyon dwellers, but nobody can know that much about so many things. So what do? You put together an interdisciplinary team. So she would assemble a strong interdisciplinary team to get the best of each team member. And the results of her work could be new fundamental research findings and/or a set of feasible, imaginative policy alternatives that are implementable and that satisfy the often conflicting goals of multiple stakeholders. So I think that's where we want to go. Get out of the canyon and do those sorts of things. And so real problems do not self-organize by academic discipline. So we have silos like that. For instance, in high school, we might teach what you have to know by those silos. And as a famous president once said, tear down these walls. Thank you very much.